Shabbat Shalom. Are you happy? You ever heard that phrase in a sarcastic way? No, surely I've never heard that. Are you happy now? But are you happy? Yeah, we just celebrated Ryan becoming bar mitzvah. It's Shabbat. We don't have to go to work today. We don't have to go to school. Lunch is around the corner, and I'm the only thing standing between you and lunch. Of course you're happy. But as you look back upon your life, the highs, the lows, the ups, the downs, are you happy? Have you led a happy life? It's a complicated question to ask, of course, have you led a happy life? Because it takes a lot of review. We go back to our childhood. We look back to our young adulthood and we say, was I happy? We look back upon challenges in our life. Perhaps health crises. Perhaps divorces. Loss of loved ones. But we also look back upon the great times. And so I'll ask you to think, what in your head, as you look back upon your life, what is the happiest moment of your life? And just think for yourself, what is the happiest moment of your life? Perhaps it was a marriage, the day of your wedding. Perhaps it was the birth of your kids. Perhaps it was your second marriage. Perhaps it was a professional success. Perhaps it was some great accomplishment in your life. Perhaps it's each and every day. We're called upon to wrestle with this notion of happiness. As we turn to our Torah portion this week, to Parashat Va-yiggash, the penultimate Torah portion of the book of Genesis. Now we know this story, right? Joseph is sold into slavery, makes his way down to Egypt. There's a famine in the land of Israel. Joseph becomes second in command over Egypt. Joseph's brothers come to seek him out. They don't recognize him. He is, so if not Paneach, he's the second in command over all of Egypt. They ask for his help. Joseph reveals himself to his brothers, grants them the help. And the children of Israel and Jacob himself move from the land of Israel down to the land of Egypt. And as Rabbi Dalan said, in our Torah, whenever we speak of going to Israel, it's always going up to the land of Israel. And whenever we speak of going to Egypt in particular, it's going down to the land of Egypt. So here we are now in our Torah portion, Parashat Va-yiggash, and all of the children of Israel and Jacob himself has made their way down to Egypt, 70 people strong. And Pharaoh says to Joseph, bring your father to me. I want to meet this guy. Who is the father of you, the second in command over all of Egypt? I want to meet this incredible person. And so I'll invite you to turn with me, if you like, in your Eitz Chaim Chumashim. And here I am on page 285. Page 285, we read, Joseph then brought his father Jacob and presented him to Pharaoh. And Jacob greeted Pharaoh. Pharaoh asked Jacob, and here the translation is, how many are the years of your life? How many are the years of your life? It's a strange question to ask someone when you first meet them. It's a really strange question for a leader of the great Egypt to ask Jacob, the father of his second in command. And in my head, I think that Pharaoh is looking upon Jacob and saying, oh my God, you look old. What is wrong with you? You can imagine the face that Jacob was putting forward. And Jacob answered Pharaoh, the years of my sojourn on earth are 130. Not bad. We'd all settle for 130. Few and hard have been the years of my life, nor do they come up to the lifespans of my fathers during their sojourns. Then Jacob bade Pharaoh farewell and left Pharaoh's presence. In that short encounter, we have a glimpse into the man we know as Yisrael, Yaakov. Yeah, I'm 130, but I'm not as old as my father and my grandfather were. My years have been tough. My sojourn on this earth, difficult. But is that how we think of Jacob? I mean, here was the man, favored by his mother, who figured out a way to get the birthright out of his brother, to get a special blessing out of his father. Here was a man who then went and acquired not just one wife whom he loved, but 4 wives, 13 children. And as the Torah tells us, he amassed a tremendous amount of wealth. Here was a man who then was able to move back to the land of Israel, to make up with his brother Esau, to settle in the land promised to his father and to his grandfather, to build there a family with all of that wealth he had accumulated. That's a man who's going to speak like this. Of course, Jacob had some tsuris. He had some tsuris. His father didn't like him particularly much. He had to swindle his brother out of that birthright. He was duped by his father-in-law. He wrestled with an angel. But he won. He had visions, encounters with God. Is that the kind of life you look back on and say, yeah, it was difficult? Or is that the kind of life you look back on and say, despite the difficulties, my life was filled with blessing? We also come to see a little bit more about Joseph himself. And you're welcome, if you want, with me to flip back a few pages to 276. And here Joseph reveals himself to his brothers. And of course, you can imagine the worry that they have, realizing all that they had done to the man who was now second in command over all of Egypt, who was going to be the difference of whether they lived or died in the midst of this famine. Then Joseph said to his brothers, it says in verse 4, "Come forward to me." And they came forward, and he says, "I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. Don't be distressed or reproach yourselves because you sold me hither. It was to save life that God sent me ahead of you. It was to save life that God sent me ahead of you. And now move, all of you, down here to Egypt, and I'll take care of you." Then Joseph adds, "So it was not you, my brothers, who sent me here, but God. And he has made me a father to Pharaoh, lord of all his household, and ruler over the land of Egypt." Now here's Joseph, who by all accounts could say that he led a pretty difficult life. You remember, he started out pretty good. He was here. He was his father's favorite one. But his brothers grew jealous of him. Then they stole his coat, threw him into a pit, and told his father he had died. Then from the pit he was captured and sold into slavery in Egypt. And there as a slave in Egypt, he was wrongly accused of sexual assault and thrown into prison in Egypt. He had reached the lowest of lows. He was in a prison, rotting away in Egypt, when he begins interpreting dreams, just as he had always done. And he gets lifted from being the lowest in Egypt to being the second in command of the most powerful country of the ancient world. Joseph's life looked like this. And what did he say to his brothers when he could have said, "Phooey on you, you sold me into this position"? He said, "Look, I forgive you. This was all part of God's plan. I'm happy now. It's because of you that I'm able to be happy." Right? Here was Joseph, who had every excuse to be miserable. And he said, "I'm happy. All of this is part of God's plan." So here now we sit in 2018, almost 2019. And I'll ask you the question, are you happy? Now, the human brain is hardwired to set up patterns, even when there aren't patterns. And I think the human brain is also set up to focus on some of the negative things that happen in our lives, because that's how we learn and that's how we grow. So we take a look at that happiest moment in our life. Perhaps it was our wedding, the birth of our children, a bar mitzvah, professional success, whatever that happiest moment was that we just talked about. You look at that happiest moment in your life and you look at now and you say, "Well, I'm not as happy as I was then. I've had tsuris. I've had challenges. My whole life has not been filled with blessing. Maybe I shouldn't look back on my life and say I'm happy." But life isn't lived in the peaks. And life isn't lived in the valleys either. At least it ought not to be. So I ask you now to take a minute and not to think about the happiest moment in your life, but to think about the moments when you're most happy. Don't think about the happiest moments in your life. Think about the moments when you are most happy. Some of those moments that happen in any given week when you're happy. And I'll ask you to take a brief minute and turn to someone sitting next to you and share with them not the happiest moment in your life, but the moments each week when you're most happy. These are the happy moments in our life, and they occur every day and every week. I'll tell you, I get to come home every day to the most beautiful, amazing woman in the world. Every Friday night, I get to bless my children. Those are happy moments. Every day I get to come to synagogue and be part of this amazing community, to be part of your lives at Congregation Shaarey Zedek. That's a blessing. Yeah, we have tsuris. Yeah, there are challenges in our lives. Not every day feels blessed. But we have a choice in our life. We can be like Jacob, who looks back upon his life and despite the blessings counts the tsuris. Or we can be like Joseph, who looks back on his life and who says, you see, in those moments of tsuris, I start now to see God's hand pointing the way. I feel God's arms wrapping around me. Because though my life is filled with tsuris, and ours is, it's a life of blessing. It's a life of joy. It's a life of happiness. On this Shabbat of Parashat Va-yiggash, when we're challenged to look at the lives of both Joseph and Jacob and how they reflect upon themselves, let us learn from their wisdom. Let us learn from their mistakes. Let us learn from their vision to know that our lives are indeed happy ones if we choose to see them in that way. If we choose to see them in that way. Ken Yehi Ratzon, may this be God's will. And let us say together.